to get my hands on the guy responsible for this mess.
Hey, hello. It's me again. I'm crawling out of my cave to bring you a Blender tutorial. We're just gonna go over some of the fundamentals of the program. Then we're gonna jump into Grease Pencil. And then I'm gonna show you some tips and tricks. Anyways, you know what this is. Let's just jump right in. Right, so the first thing you're going to see after you launch Blender is this cute little splash screen. And what we're going to do here is just choose a 2D animation file in the new file category. Don't worry if you click out of that, you can open it up again at any time by going into the Blender menu in the top left corner of the screen. Or alternatively, you could go into File, New, and create a 2D animation file from here. Now, if this is your first experience with Blender, this might seem a bit overwhelming. First of all, back in my days, you know, it was a lot worse. I remember that the first time I launched the program, I thought it was some sort of elaborate flight simulator. Luckily, much like in a real airplane, you only have to learn what some of the buttons do. Trust me, I've been using this software for a good couple years now, and I still haven't touched the movie clip editor. It all depends on your use case, of course, so we're only going to go over the things you need to know before jumping into Grease Pencil. First things first, Blender's UI is divided into smaller sections that you can resize, add or remove at will by dragging out from a corner in any given direction. You can change what these docs display by choosing an editor type in the menu in the top left corner. But we're not really going to be messing around with that, since we chose the 2D animation file type from the get-go. We already have everything we need to start working, including a 3D viewport. This is the editor that displays our scene, and it's where we'll be spending most of our time. A Grease Pencil timeline, which allows us to animate our scene. Playback controls, an object outliner, which displays a list of the objects in our current scene. And last but not least, a properties panel, where you can find basically any option you'd need at a given time related to your file, scene, or the object you have selected. At the very top of the screen you'll find a classic menu bar, which does exactly what you'd expect if you've ever used a computer in your life. Right next to that, you'll see a bunch of different tabs. These are your workspaces. And you can see that we already have a couple set up by default for the different types of workflows you might need for 2D animation. Now, if your brain hasn't imploded yet, you might have heard me refer to this right here as a 3D viewport. And you might be a little confused. I mean, this is a 2D animation file, right? All we see is a white canvas and a bunch of basic drawing tools, but if you press the middle mouse button and start moving your mouse, you'll see that, this really is 3D. Fun fact, if you actually try hard enough, you can do this in real life and move into the fourth dimension. But yeah, this is something that you should keep in mind, even if you're only planning to do 2D work in here. Blender is, at its core, a piece of 3D software, and a lot of that philosophy is reflected in how the Grease Pencil works. In a way, it might help to think of it as something closer to vector-based graphical applications rather than a traditional raster one. Anyways, let's go back to our original camera view, either by pressing 0 on the numpad or by pressing this little camera button on the right side of your viewport. A side note, I'm probably going to be using a lot of keyboard shortcuts in this video. There are ways to do a lot of these with just the mouse, but I really recommend you memorize some of them because it will cut down on a lot of time. Now, seriously, if you try using Blender without using keyboard shortcuts, it's going to take you years to do even the most basic things. To make this a bit easier to grasp, I've enabled a little panel in the bottom left corner, which displays what I'm pressing at all times, so I hope that helps. So yeah, anyways, you rotate the view by holding the middle mouse button. If you also hold shift, you can pan around, or if you hold control, you can zoom in and out. You can also roll your view by pressing shift and either 4 or 6 on the numpad, but this one's a bit weird. You can also enter game mode by pressing shift and tilde. That's basically it for the navigation. You're gonna have to listen to me talk about some boring shit for a couple more minutes, because I'm gonna use this as an opportunity to explain the concept of interaction modes. You see, basically, there are many different ways of interacting with and editing objects in the 3D viewport. Interaction modes give you different sets of tools depending on what you want to do with your object. For example, if you want to move an object, you're going to have to use a different mode than if you want to paint a texture on it. You can switch modes in the drop-down menu right next to the editor type, or by using this radial menu that comes up if you press Ctrl Tab. Now, about those objects I keep talking about. Every scene in Blender is constructed from objects. These are everything that's present in the 3D space. Meshes, curves, lights, cameras, and of course, grease pencil objects, which are drawn in that space. You can add, remove, and make basic edits to objects in, you guessed it, object mode. Okay, so I understand this whole paradigm might be a bit abstract for people who aren't used to this mode of working. So here's a small practical example. I just drew this little table and I want to put something on it, like, I don't know, a flower pot. Well, I could just draw it here, maybe on a new layer, and call it a day, but what if I don't really like the placement of this pot? I want to rotate it just a little. Well, there's a bit of a problem, because if I now go to object mode and try to move this, either by pressing G or using one of these bad boys, you can see that because this is still one grease pencil object, both of them move at the same time. And you know, this might be desirable depending on what you're going for, but in my case, a much better approach would be to go into object mode, press Shift A to add a new object, pick an empty grease pencil object, and now if I go into draw mode and draw something, you can see that it is entirely separate from the first object. Hypothetically, let's say you want to export your work as an image or a video. Now, in that hypothetical situation, wouldn't you say want to tweak the settings of your output file? Well, good news, my friend, because you can do that right here in this cute little sub-menu. You can choose the resolution, aspect ratio, and frame rate of your file up here, and the file format down here. If you want to tweak the render properties, go into this tab right here, and you can tweak your render quality and turn on effects like ambient occlusion and bloom. After you're done with these settings, just go up here into the render tab and choose either an image or a video file. The brushes in Blender are pretty non-conventional. In most painting applications, different brushes have like different textures and shapes. Not here, you only really have one round brush tip and that's it. But there are a bunch of different settings you can tweak to make it look a bit more interesting, like size, strength, and randomness. The default brushes that you can see up here and in the properties panel are basically just slightly different presets of these settings, and you can easily access them from the panel up here or again in the properties panel. So for example, if I wanted a brush size to be affected by pen pressure, I just press this little icon and then I can adjust the fall off curve right here. And just like that, we pretty much replicated the ink pen brush. Now, if I go into the stroke settings, enable randomize, and bump up the radius a little, we got the ink pen rough brush. I highly encourage you to play around with some of these settings yourself. I won't be going over them in too much detail because most of them are pretty self-explanatory. There is a way to set this up so that your brush actually uses an image texture in the material, but it is very limited. There are two main ways in which grease pencil handles color: materials and vertex colors. Materials are basically sets of visual properties that are applied to grease pencil strokes. Just like brushes, they can be switched from this panel up here, or you can manage them in this submenu in the properties panel. As you can see, materials contain information not only about the stroke color, but also about the line type, style, and the color fill. Now, by default, this object is set up with 4 material slots, but you can add or remove them by using these two beautiful buttons. Keep in mind, materials are actually completely separate from the object, meaning that multiple objects can use the same material, which is pretty handy. To actually add a new material, you have to either click this icon on an already occupied slot or this button on an empty one. If you want to remove a material, you can't. You can't. You can't. You can't. You can't. Until you close the file, that is. At which point every material that doesn't have an existing user is removed. You can prevent this by clicking on this little shield icon. So, okay, let's say I want to make a red stroke. It seems simple enough. I just pick the solid stroke material and then I change the color to red. And that seems to work until I want to put down a green stroke. And now, because the strokes are using the same material, they also change colors. Now, You could just make a new material every time you want to change a color, but it would be very tedious and it would get really messy really quickly. So what's the solution? Every grease pencil object, just like a 3D mesh, is made out of little interconnected points called vertices. You can see this a bit better if I go into edit mode by pressing tab. Now, apart from obviously making up the geometry of the stroke, the vertices also store other data, like line thickness, which you can change using this tool, and color, hence vertex colors. Back in the draw mode, you can switch between the material's base color and the vertex color right here, or you can paint on existing strokes in the vertex paint mode. And, as you can see, we no longer have that problem. Now, up to this point, we've only really been talking about strokes, stroke styles, stroke line types, stroke colors. But what about our good friend Fill? Well, if you've learned anything from this so far, you should probably already know that it doesn't exactly work as you'd expect. First of all, the fill tool uses your current material, so if your material doesn't have fill enabled, it will just create this. Second of all, the fill tool actually creates a separate surface from the one you're trying to fill, so if you want those to be connected, you should just enable fill in the material that the first surface is using. One thing you can do with the fill that you really can't with the stroke is gradients, which you can do a lot of cool things with. You can change the alpha value of the colors, mix them with vertex colors, remap them. It's really cool. Also, the texture style works a lot better than it does on the strokes.
Apaga el video ahora o sufre un castigo de crueldad más allá de tu comprensión.
Layers actually do work pretty much how you'd expect. You can manage them in this submenu and in the top right corner of your viewport. You can lock them, toggle their visibility, enable onion skin if they're animated, or enable a mask layer. To use a mask, you just have to enable it down here and then add an existing layer as a mask. You can merge layers and do some other shit in this menu right here. You also have a bunch of different blend modes at your disposal, which in combination with textures can give you some really cool effects. What's really cool about this is that by default, the depth order of the layers is indicated by their order in the layer stack instead of the 3D location. You can use this to achieve some really trippy effects. In this example, the brighter layer is physically in front of the darker one, but it's below it in the layer stack, so it gets rendered behind it. Also, by default, every layer reacts to lights, which you can add in the object mode, so you can get some really dynamic shading if you know how to use those. If you need consistent lighting, I'd advise you to disable this. You can add a tint to your layer or tweak its stroke thickness in this submenu right here. So, I already explained the basic concept of interaction modes, but do we actually have any use for them apart from managing objects and obviously drawing? Well, other than draw mode and vertex paint mode, which I've already mentioned, there are two modes that allow you to do some interesting things with grease pencil objects. There's edit mode and sculpt mode. Let's start with the first. Edit mode is great for making small adjustments to existing grease pencil strokes. Just as in object mode, you can move, scale, and rotate your selection. There are 3 different selection modes. By default, Blender puts you into stroke selection mode, but we can also choose to be able to select intersecting strokes and vertices. When I previously mentioned edit mode, I showed you that you can change the thickness of individual points on the stroke using this tool, but you can transform it in a lot more ways. You can move individual vertices, extrude them by pressing E, delete them, duplicate them to create separate strokes. You can shear or bend your selection by using these tools. The context menu allows you to subdivide your strokes, smooth or mirror them. You can also edit the stroke as a curve if you enable this option. Apart from affecting geometry, you can also move selected strokes into different layers, rearrange them, break them apart into separate objects by pressing P, or assign them different materials in the Materials tab. You can also use this tool to remap textures on the stroke fill. I could also probably mention that you can interpolate between selected keyframes right here, but animation is an entirely separate topic. Sculpt mode is basically a more advanced version of the liquefy tool in Photoshop. You can use it to smoothen, push, pinch and twirl existing geometry, and also tweak the thickness and strength of a stroke. Also, if you copy a stroke in edit mode, you can use it as a stamp, which is kind of interesting.
No has resuelto nada, tus días están contados.
Modifiers and effects are your ways of procedural, non-destructive editing. They're operations that you can attach to grease pencil objects to achieve all kinds of effects. Generally speaking, modifiers affect the geometry of grease pencil objects. For example, they can be used to extend, duplicate, and offset grease pencil strokes. You can attach the stroke to different objects to deform it. You can rig it with the armature modifier and much more. Effects are more about the appearance of the stroke. They're basically just cosmetic filters. They're a lot less technical and pretty self-explanatory. You have your blur, your drop shadow, your glow, wave distortion, etc, etc. But you might notice that as I go through these, seemingly nothing changes. Why is that? Well, it's not because the effects don't work, they're just not being rendered. You see, Blender has 4 different shading modes. There's wireframe mode, solid mode, material preview mode, and rendered mode. By default, Blender puts us in material preview mode, which renders materials but doesn't use scene lights or effects. To actually see them, we need to go into rendered mode. Keep in mind, in heavier scenes, this might come with a performance cost. When working with grease pencil, the other 2 modes aren't really that useful since they don't actually display the grease pencil color, just the geometry of some basic shading. There's one thing that I wanted to mention, but I don't really know where to put this, so the white background can actually be changed to anything you'd like. You don't have to like draw over it or anything. Just go into this tab in the properties panel and change the color. Or if you'd like it to be a texture or something else, you click on the yellow button to its left. I think that's basically all you need to start working in 2D, so if you're only here for that, then have a good one and good luck. But if you want to go a step further and move into 3D, then please, come with me, my child. Okay, so even though we can move around in 3D, right now we're only drawing on a flat plane. So we gotta solve this. So if you look right up here, right next to the guides, which I haven't really mentioned, but yeah, you can enable some simple guides up here. You have these 2 menus. The one on the right sets your drawing plane, which, as you can see, is currently set to front XZ. The XZ refers to the 2 axes that make up the plane, which are represented on... So the front, side and top options are pretty self-explanatory. The view option just makes it so that, well, your current view determines the plane you're drawing on. The cursor setting might seem a bit esoteric though. The thing is, this isn't actually referring to your mouse cursor, but Blender's 3D cursor, which you can't see right now because by default it is disabled in the 2D animation file type. You can enable it by going into the overlay menu right here and checking this box. When using the 3D cursor as a drawing plane, Blender uses its orientation to determine the placement of your strokes. You can move the 3D cursor using this tool, or snap it to different points using the radial menu that comes up when you press Shift and S. The other menu determines your stroke placement, where your strokes start, where they end. By default, this is set to origin. Now, the origin of a surface is represented by this little orange dot in object mode, and it basically functions as a center point for the object. This means that by default every operation you make on this object will use this as its point of reference. For example, the object will rotate and scale around this point. This means that if this option is chosen, our grease pencil strokes will also gravitate towards this point. You can change the placement of it in object mode in this menu right here. The other options we have are 3D cursor, which just means that your strokes will gravitate toward the 3D cursor instead of the origin. You also have surface and stroke. Now, this is really interesting. Surface allows you to draw on any 3D object. You can also set an offset for it right here, which affects how far away from the surface your strokes are placed. But the grease pencil object remains separate from the mesh it's based on, which means that you can move them independently or even just hide or remove the 3D object when you're done with it. The stroke placement just makes it so that strokes stick to other strokes, and you can set whether you want all points on the stroke to follow the path or just the end/start of the stroke. Here's all the stuff that I couldn't fit anywhere else. Even if you're not really making an animation but you're working in 3D, you're probably going to want to show off that side of your work. In that case, it might be useful to know that you can keyframe the position of any object in object mode, including the camera. In this file type, auto keying is enabled by default, so all you have to do is go into object mode, select the camera, add the first keyframe by pressing I and choosing the properties you want to keyframe. In this example, I'm just going to choose location, rotation and scale. Move to another frame on the timeline and move the camera. Quick and easy. To actually see the camera's keyframes, you'll have to change the dope sheet type from grease pencil to dope sheet. You can change your brush size really quickly by pressing F and your brush strength by pressing Shift F. Holding down Control usually inverts the tool you're currently using. For example, in draw mode, holding down Control will give you an eraser. Always remember to name your objects in the outliner and properly label your layers. Use 3D to your advantage. Remember, you don't have to rely on optical illusions and visual trickery here. This is real 3D. Using the noise modifier can give your scene a lot of energy, no effort required. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I'm legitimately grateful, and I sincerely hope that you found this video helpful. I'm sorry if it feels a little disjointed. This whole project was a huge mess, but anyways, I'm not gonna rant for too long about that. In the next video, I'm actually gonna go over a full scene, how to create a full scene from start to finish, and actually put some of these things into practice. I don't know how long that will take to come out. So don't hold your breath or anything. Follow me on Twitter, I guess. I have an Instagram too. Links to that are going to be in the description. I stream on Twitch like twice a year, so if you want to be around for that, have a good one, and see you in the next video, maybe?